It's not much. Rocky soil, nothing grows here. But it's yours, Elijah. 50 years. I appreciate it, Mr. Holt. You earned it.
Franklin Holt said it the way men say things when they want the saying to do more work than the thing itself. He was standing at the edge of the property line, his boot heel on the red clay, his hand sweeping out toward 40 acres of scrub pine and rocky ground that sat on the western edge of the Holt family's 1,200-acre cattle operation in Beaufort County, Texas. Rocky soil doesn't drain right. We've tried grazing it twice and the cattle don't take to it. He paused. But it's yours, Elijah, 50 years. A man ought to have something to show for 50 years. The man beside him was 71 years old. He was wearing the same work boots he'd worn for 20 years, resoled 3 times, the leather gone soft in the places where his feet had shaped it. He looked out at the 40 acres, at the scrub pine and the rocky ground and the particular, unlovely red clay that the Holts had never been able to do anything with. He said, "I appreciate it, Mr. Holt." "You earned it," Franklin said, with the ease of a man who believes what he is saying because it costs him nothing to believe it. Elijah James Cutter had started on the Holt Ranch in 1972, at 21 years old, and had worked every year of the 50 that followed with the specific, undramatic consistency of a man who understood that the work was the work, and the work needed doing, and the fact that it needed doing was sufficient reason to do it well. He had repaired every fence on the property. He had managed the cattle rotation for 30 years. He had kept the equipment running through every drought and every flood and every season that tried the ranch in ways the Holts had not anticipated and would not have survived without him. Franklin Holt had given him 40 acres of land that the family had been unable to use for 40 years. Elijah looked at it. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, completely, without hurry, with the specific attention of a man who had spent 50 years noticing what the land told you if you were patient enough to listen, and what the land was telling him through the specific color of the clay, through the way the ground sloped, through something he had seen 20 years ago that he had filed away and never forgotten, was something Franklin Holt had never thought to hear. In 14 months, a geologist from Dallas would stand on that same red clay and say a single word that would change everything. Stay with this story. Subscribe, because what sits beneath 40 acres of scrub pine in Beaufort County, Texas, is not worthlessness, and the man who knew it has been walking above it for 20 years. But to understand that moment, you have to understand who Elijah Cutter was, not what the Holts saw when they looked at him, what he actually was. The Holt Ranch had been in the family since 1891, when Franklin's great-grandfather had purchased 1,200 acres of Texas grassland with capital from a cotton operation in Louisiana, and the specific confidence of a man who believed that the land would do what he told it. The ranch had grown and contracted and grown again over 4 generations, shaped by drought and market prices, and the particular decisions each generation made about what to hold and what to sell. By the time Franklin Holt inherited it in 1994, it was a working cattle operation of genuine scale, not the largest in Beaufort County, but established, with a reputation for consistent quality and the kind of institutional knowledge that took generations to build. Franklin was a competent rancher. He understood cattle. He understood grazing patterns and water management and the specific economics of beef production in a competitive market. What he did not understand, what he had never needed to understand, because the ranch had always had people who understood it better than he did, was the land itself, the deep language of it, the geological and hydrological knowledge that told you not just what the surface could produce, but what lay beneath it and what that meant. He had always had Elijah for that. He had not known that was what Elijah was doing. He had thought Elijah was maintaining the property. He had not understood that maintenance, done at Elijah's level of attention, was a form of reading, that every repair and every seasonal check and every walk across every section of the property was accumulating, over 50 years, into a knowledge of the land that no survey had captured and no map contained. The 40 acres on the western edge had been a problem property for as long as Franklin could remember. His father had tried grazing it. His grandfather had tried it before that. The clay was wrong. The drainage was wrong. The cattle moved through it without interest, finding nothing they wanted, and the family had eventually accepted it as the kind of land that simply refused to participate in the ranch's productivity. They had stopped thinking about it. Elijah had never stopped thinking about it. Elijah James Cutter was born in Beaufort County in 1951, the fourth of 6 children, in a house on a road that had not been paved until he was 9 years old, and that had been named sometime in the decade before his birth, for a family that had nothing to do with the people who lived on it. His father, Earl, worked the land, not as an owner but as a laborer, moving between the properties in the county with the seasonal rhythm of men who sold their work, because selling the work was what was available. He was good at it. He had the specific knowledge of someone who has worked the same geography for decades, who knows where the water runs in a wet year and where the ground goes hard in a dry one, who can read the sky and the soil with the practical, accumulated accuracy of long experience. He had tried to teach Elijah, not formally, there was no formal about it. He had simply taken him along and let the land teach him through proximity and repetition, the way most real knowledge is transmitted. Elijah had been a good student, better than his father knew, because Elijah's attention went deeper than the practical. He was not just learning what to do with the land, but why the land was the way it was, the underlying logic of it, the reasons behind the patterns his father pointed to without naming. He had read. Not in school, though he had gone to school, had been a capable student, had finished high school in 1969 at a time when finishing was not guaranteed and required a specific, sustained effort in Beaufort County if you were black. He had read on his own, from the library in town, and from the Texas A&M Extension Program publications that arrived by mail, and that he had requested himself at 17 after a conversation with an extension agent who had visited the county and who had, in an unguarded moment of professional honesty, told Elijah that the most interesting geology in the county was on its western edge, and that nobody had looked at it properly in 40 years. Elijah had asked why not. The extension agent had said, because the surface doesn't look like anything. People look at the surface and they move on. Elijah had been 17. He had filed that sentence away and not taken it out for 20 years, when he first walked the western section of the Holt property and felt, beneath his boots, the particular quality of the ground that he had been reading about since he was 17 years old. He had not said anything. He was a laborer on someone else's land. The observation was not his to act on. He had noted it in the internal catalog he kept of everything the land told him, and he had gone on with his work. He had been noting it in that catalog for 20 years. He was born in 1951 and came to the Holt Ranch in 1972 at 21, when Franklin's father, George Holt, was looking for a reliable hand, and Elijah had a reputation in the county, even at 21, for being the person you called when you needed something done correctly. He had married at 24. His wife's name was Ruth, a schoolteacher, precise and warm, who had grown up 3 counties over and who had understood, when she met Elijah, that she was looking at a person whose depth was not visible from the surface, and who required patience and attention to know. She had given him both. They had 2 children, a son named Marcus, who was now 44 and worked as a civil engineer in Houston, and a daughter named Clara, who was 41 and had been a high school science teacher in Beaufort County for 15 years. Ruth had died in 2019. Cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, which had been 18 months of the specific, terrible grace of watching someone you love leave by degrees. Elijah had been present for every degree. He had not missed a day at the ranch during that period, not because he did not grieve, but because the work and the grief occupied different rooms in him and both needed tending. He had been walking the Holt property when she died. Not because he did not know it was happening. He had known, had been on the phone with Marcus that morning, had said goodbye in the way you say goodbye when you understand the word is carrying its full weight. He had walked because the land was where his thinking went clearest, and because Ruth had always understood that and had, in the last week, told him, "Go walk it." That's where you know how to be. He had walked the western section that morning. He had stood on the red clay. He had felt, beneath his boots, what he had been feeling for 20 years. He had thought, someday I'll know what to do with this. And that was the thing Franklin Holt never saw coming. What was at stake was not, in the immediate sense, the land. The land was 40 acres of problem property that the Holts had never found a use for and had given away as a retirement gift in the specific. Comfortable way of people who believe they are being generous while spending nothing they value. What was at stake was the question that Elijah had been carrying for 20 years. The question that his father had not known to ask, and the extension agent had not thought anyone would follow up on, and the Holts had never considered because they had never had a reason to look at the western section as anything other than what it appeared to be. The question was simple. It had been simple since he was 17 years old, and an extension agent told him the most interesting geology in the county was on its western edge. He had spent 50 years walking above the answer. Now the land was his. He had 3 weeks before he needed to decide what to do with that. 3 weeks. He drove home from the Holt property on the same road he had driven for 50 years. The road was paved now, had been since 1987, when the county finally got around to it. He remembered when it wasn't. He sat at the kitchen table in the house he and Ruth had bought in 1978, which was the same house his children had grown up in and which still held, in its dimensions and its light, the specific shape of a life that had been built in it. He picked up the phone. He called Marcus. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "They gave you the land," Marcus said when Elijah told him. 40 acres, western section. A pause. Marcus was a civil engineer. He understood soil and substrate and the specific relationship between surface characteristics and what lay beneath them. Elijah had told him, over the years, what he had observed on the western section. Marcus had listened the way children listen to parents who know more than they let on, with the specific, patient attention of someone who understands that what's being offered is not just information, but a form of transmission. Marcus said, "Dad," Elijah said, "I know. You've been saying for 20 years, I know. What are you going to do?" Elijah looked out the window at the yard where Ruth had grown a kitchen garden for 30 years. The garden was still there. Clara maintained it now, came by on weekends, grew the same things Ruth had grown because it was the same ground and the same light, and it knew what to do. He said, "I'm going to find out if I was right," Marcus said. "How?" Elijah said. "There's a woman at the A&M Extension office. Clara's colleague's husband knows her. She does independent geological assessments, mineral rights evaluation," Marcus said. "You've already looked into it." "I looked into it 20 years ago," Elijah said. "I just didn't have the land then." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long would it take?" "She can walk it in a day, preliminary assessment in a week. Full report if the preliminary says what I think it'll say in 6 to 8 weeks," Marcus said. "And if you're right, if I'm right," Elijah said, "then we'll know what to do next." He called the extension office the following morning. He left a message. The geologist, a woman named Dr. Sandra Nwasu, who had spent 22 years doing mineral rights assessments across West Texas and East Texas, and the specific, geologically complicated territory in between, called him back that afternoon. He told her what he had observed, not the conclusions, the observations, the specific color and composition of the clay, The way the ground sloped, the seep he had noticed in a wet year, 15 years ago, that had appeared for 3 months and then stopped. The particular way the rock outcropped along the northern edge of the property. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. She said, "How long have you been watching this land?" 20 years on that section, he said. 50 years on the surrounding property, she said. What's your background? Ranch hand, he said. 50 years, another pause, she said. When can I come out? 11 days. Doctor. Sandra Nwasu arrived on a Tuesday. She was 53 years old, compact and precise, with the specific quality of attention that geologists develop through decades of asking the land questions and learning to hear what it says back. She walked the property with Elijah for 4 hours. He did not explain. He showed. He pointed to the outcrop at the northern edge. He showed her the seep, dry now, but the ground around it still darker than the surrounding clay, still holding the memory of what had come through it. He showed her the specific slope of the ground, the way it ran toward a low point that shouldn't have been a low point based on the surrounding topography. She looked at everything he showed her. She took samples. She made notes. She had instruments that he did not have and that provided her with measurements his observations could not. But she was also doing what he had been doing for 20 years, reading, listening, letting the land speak. At the end of the 4 hours, they stood at the edge of the property, where Franklin Holt had stood 2 weeks earlier with his boot heel on the red clay, and his hand sweeping out at 40 acres of scrub pine and rocky ground. She looked at the land. She looked at her notes. She said, "Mr. Cutter, I want to be careful about what I say before the full assessment is complete." He said, "I understand," she said, "but I want to ask you something. The seep you described, the one that appeared 15 years ago in the wet year." "Yes." "What color was the water?" he said. "It wasn't water." She looked at him. He said, "It was darker than water. It ran slower than water, and it left a stain on the rock that didn't wash off in the rain." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Why didn't you say anything about it?" "It wasn't my land," he said. She looked at him. She said, "It is now." He nodded. She said, "I'll have the preliminary assessment to you in a week." She drove back to Austin. He walked back across the 40 acres alone. The ground under his boots was the same ground it had always been, rocky, red clay, the scrub pine casting the same thin shadows in the afternoon light. Nothing on the surface had changed. Everything underneath it was what it had always been. He had simply known, and now he had the land, and soon he would have the paper that said what he had known. He walked to the center of the property and stood there for a moment. He thought about Ruth, about her saying, "Go walk it. That's where you know how to be." He was on it. He knew exactly where he was. 6 days. The preliminary assessment arrived on a Monday. Dr. Nwasu called him before she sent it. She said, "Mr. Cutter, I need you to sit down." He was already sitting. He was at the kitchen table where he did most of his significant thinking, in the chair that had been his chair for 46 years. He said, "I'm sitting," she said, "the seep, the slope, the outcrop on the northern edge, the clay composition." She paused. "This is consistent with a surface expression of a significant subsurface oil and gas formation. I can't give you final numbers without the full assessment, but the preliminary indicators are strong." He said, "How strong?" she said. "Strong enough that I want to recommend full seismic testing before you talk to anyone else, before you tell anyone anything. Because the moment this is known, people are going to come to you with offers, and you need to understand what you have before you decide what to do with it." He said, "How long is the full assessment?" 6 weeks. "I want to bring in a seismic team. It'll cost." She gave him the number. He said, "Do it." She said, "Mr. Cutter, I want to be honest with you. I've done 216 assessments in 22 years. This is one of the top 5 preliminary profiles I've seen." He was quiet. She said, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" He said, "I understand." He put the phone down. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He thought about the extension agent who had told a 17-year-old boy that the most interesting geology in the county was on its western edge, and that nobody had looked at it properly in 40 years. He had looked. For 50 years he had looked. He picked up the phone again. He called Marcus. Marcus said, "What did she say?" Elijah said. "She said it's one of the top 5 preliminary profiles she's seen in 22 years. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Marcus said, "Dad." Elijah said, "I know." Marcus said, "What do we do?" Elijah said, "We wait for the full assessment. We don't say anything to anyone. We let the land tell us what it is." Marcus said, "How long?" 6 weeks. Marcus said, "I'm coming home." Elijah said, "You don't have to. I'm coming home," Marcus said. He came on the following Friday with Clara, and they sat at the kitchen table that had held the family's significant moments for 46 years, and Elijah told them what he had observed and what he had suspected and what Dr. Nwasu had said, and they sat with it the way the family had always sat with important things, without rushing toward the conclusion, letting the weight of it arrive at its own pace. Clara said, "You've known this for 20 years. I've suspected it," Elijah said. "I didn't know I suspected. And you never said anything." "It wasn't my land," he said. "And suspecting and knowing are different things. I don't speak until I know." Clara looked at him. She had her mother's quality of attention, the specific, complete way of looking at a person that saw past what they were presenting to what they actually were. She said, "Mama knew, didn't she?" "It was not a question," Elijah said. "She knew I suspected. She never asked me to say more than I knew." Clara looked at the table. Marcus said, "When the assessment comes back, what do we do?" Elijah said, "We get a lawyer who specializes in mineral rights. We understand our position completely before we talk to anyone else. And then we decide together what to do with it." He looked at his children. He said, "This is not mine, it's ours. What I built for us. Your mother understood that. Now you understand it. If you need to see what the assessment said, subscribe, because what Dr. Nwasu's seismic team found beneath 40 acres of Beaufort County scrub pine is not what Franklin Holt imagined when he swept his hand across the property and said it's not much to look at asterisk. And it is not something that left the Cutter family where it found them. The full assessment arrived 6 weeks and 2 days after the seismic team completed their work. Dr. Nwasu drove from Austin to deliver it in person. She sat at the kitchen table, Marcus on one side, Clara on the other, Elijah at the head, and she opened the report and she said a number. The number was an estimated recoverable reserve. It was a large number. It was the kind of number that required the people hearing it to sit with it before they could respond, because the brain needed a moment to place it in the correct register of reality. Marcus looked at his father. Clara looked at the report. Elijah looked at his hands. He had worked with those hands for 50 years. They were the hands of a man who had repaired fences and managed cattle and walked every section of someone else's land for half a century. They were the hands that had felt, through boot leather and instinct and 50 years of accumulated knowledge, what was underneath the red clay on the western edge of the Holt property. Those 40 acres had been given to him because Franklin Holt believed they were worthless. They were not worthless. They had never been worthless. Dr. Nwasu said, "You'll need a mineral rights attorney. I can give you 3 names. People I've worked with who are honest and who have handled situations of this scale." Elijah said, "We have one." Marcus has been in contact. She looked at him. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated the possibility," he said. "I prepared for the possibility," she said. "Mr. Cutter. In 22 years, I have walked properties with owners who understood the land and owners who didn't. In my experience, the owners who understand the land really understand it. The way you do, they always knew something was there before I confirmed it." She paused. "How did you know?" he said. "My father taught me to listen," she said. "He must have been a remarkable man." Elijah said, "He was a laborer. He worked other people's land his whole life. He never owned an acre." He looked at the report. "But he taught me how to read it." The mineral rights negotiation took 8 months. Elijah engaged a specialist attorney from Houston, a woman named Patricia Webb who had spent 20 years in oil and gas mineral rights law and who understood, from the first conversation, exactly what she was working with and exactly what her client's position was. She had said in their first meeting, "You own the surface rights. The Holts gifted you the property outright, in writing, signed and notarized. The mineral rights in Texas are severable from surface rights, but in the absence of a prior severance, and we've checked, there is none for this parcel. The mineral rights transfer with the property." Elijah had said, "So they're mine." She had said, "They are yours, which means any subsurface resource on this property belongs to you. And any company that wants to access those resources must negotiate with you." She had negotiated on his behalf with 4 companies over 8 months. Not from desperation, from the specific patience of a man who had waited 50 years and was not going to rush the last part of the process. The final agreement included a signing bonus, a royalty percentage, and terms for surface use that Patricia Webb had fought for specifically because Elijah had told her, "The land is mine. Whatever happens beneath it, the surface stays what I say it stays." He did not sell the land. He leased the mineral rights. The land remained his. It would remain his children's after him. The caliche and the red clay and the scrub pine would remain. The cattle, a small herd he had put on the property in the first month of ownership, just to see if they would take to it under different management, would remain. He had been right about that too. The cattle had taken to it fine. The Holts had simply never managed it correctly. Franklin Holt found out through the Beaufort County record filings, which were public. A clerk in his attorney's office noticed the mineral lease recorded under the Cutter name and brought it to Franklin's attention. Franklin called Elijah. Elijah answered. Franklin said, "I heard about the assessment." Elijah said, "Yes." A long silence. Franklin said, "We didn't know." Elijah said, "No, 50 years, Franklin said. "You worked this land for 50 years. You must have noticed something." Elijah said, "I noticed." Another silence, longer. Franklin said, "Why didn't you say?" Elijah said, "It wasn't my land." The silence after that lasted long enough that Elijah thought Franklin had set the phone down. Then Franklin said, "You should have said." Elijah looked out the window at the yard. He said, "Mr. Holt, your family paid me a salary for 50 years. I did the work I was hired to do. What I observed on the property was part of the work. The conclusions I drew from those observations were mine. When the land became mine, I acted on them." He paused. He said, "If you had asked me in 50 years, if you had once asked me what I saw when I walked the western section, I would have told you. I would have answered the question honestly." "I always answer questions honestly," Franklin said. "You never volunteered it." Elijah said, "You never asked." The silence this time was different. It had the specific weight of a man sitting with the distance between what he had assumed and what had been true, and understanding that the distance was not Elijah's failure but his own. Franklin said, "No, I didn't." Elijah said, "No." Franklin said nothing else for a moment. Then he said, "Congratulations, Elijah." Elijah said, "Thank you, Mr. Holt." He put the phone down. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. He thought about 50 years of watching and listening and noting. About a 17-year-old boy and an extension agent, and a sentence he had kept for 54 years. The most interesting geology in the county is on its western edge, and nobody has looked at it properly in 40 years. Somebody had looked. He had looked. Every single day for 50 years he had looked. He bought the house next door for Marcus. Not a large house. The same scale as his own, the same neighborhood, the specific geography of a family that wants to be close without being on top of each other. Marcus came back from Houston with his wife and his 2 sons, and put them in the house next door, and walked across the yard for dinner on Sunday nights, the way children walk to their parents' houses. When the distance is right. He set up a scholarship at the high school where Clara taught. It was in Ruth's name. It covered 4 years of college for 1 student per year, selected by the faculty on the basis of a criterion Elijah had specified. A student who has demonstrated the ability to see past what is obvious to what is true. Clara had read the criterion and looked at her father. She had said, "That's you," he had said. "That's your mother. She saw me when nobody else was looking." He put the scholarship in her name because that was right. He visited the extension agent, who had told him about the geology 54 years ago. The man was 81 years old, retired, living in a house in Beaufort County that he had built himself in 1974. He opened the door and looked at Elijah, and it took him a moment. 54 years was a long time, and then he said, "I know you," Elijah said. "You told me something when I was 17, the man said. "Come in." They sat on his porch for 2 hours. Elijah told him what had happened. The man listened with the specific, complete attention of someone receiving news that confirms something he has always believed about what happens when you give good information to someone who knows what to do with it. When Elijah finished, the man said, "I told about 60 young people that same information over the years. You're the first one who did something with it," Elijah said. "The others didn't have the land." The man said, "No, but some of them had access to land. They just didn't stay with it." He looked at Elijah. He said, "You stayed." Elijah said, "I stayed." The sign over the property gate said, "Cutter Land Est." 2023. He had put it up on a Saturday morning with Marcus and Clara, the 3 of them working together with the specific, quiet companionship of people who have done things together long enough that the doing does not require commentary. Marcus had held the post, Clara had read the level, Elijah had driven the anchor. When it was in, they had stood back and looked at it. The sign was not elaborate, black letters on white background. The name and the year, his name, his land. He had worked other people's land for 50 years. He had learned it and read it and listened to it, and understood it in ways the people who owned it had not thought to develop. He had carried that knowledge for 50 years without a place to put it. Now he had 40 acres of red clay and scrub pine, and a geological formation beneath it that had been there, patient and unchanged, for longer than anyone in Beaufort County had been alive. The land had waited for someone who knew what to look for. He had waited for the land. They had found each other eventually. That was how it usually worked if you were patient enough. There is a kind of knowledge that takes decades to become useful, not because the knowledge is slow, because the conditions for its use require time to arrive. The observation at 17. The 50 years of watching. The land that is finally yours. The moment when what you have always known meets the circumstances that allow you to act on it. Earl Cutter worked other people's land his whole life and never owned an acre. He taught his son to read the land not because he knew what his son would eventually find beneath it, but because reading the land was the most honest knowledge he had. And honest knowledge was the most important thing he could transmit. Elijah received that transmission. He carried it for 50 years. He walked above a geological formation that was worth more than the entire operation he had spent his career maintaining. And he did not say a word about it because the land was not his, and he was not a man who spoke before he knew, and he was not a man who claimed what was not his to claim. When it became his, he acted, carefully, patiently, completely. The land had been worthless in the eyes of every person who had owned it. It had been exactly what it was in the eyes of the man who had walked it. Those 2 things are not a contradiction. They are the most important distinction you can learn to make. The appearance of a thing and the nature of a thing are not the same. Elijah Cutter had known that since he was 17. He had waited 54 years for the conditions to prove it. Here is the question this story leaves behind. What have you been walking above, in your own history, your own knowledge, your own life, that you have not yet had the conditions to act on? And are you paying close enough attention to recognize the moment when those conditions finally arrive? If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe. Stay close. The next one is already coming. And it starts the same way, with someone being given something that everyone has decided has no value, and ending the same way, with the truth of it rising to the surface, patient, unchanged. Exactly what it always was. Drop a comment. Tell me, what knowledge are you carrying that the world hasn't found a use for yet? Let it be seen even here, even now, because everything deserves to be seen for what it actually is.